This program is a presentation of UCTV for educational and non-commercial use only.
My name is George Sanchez. I'm a professor in American Studies, Ethnicity, and in History at USC. I'm also the director of the Center for Diversity and Democracy there, and the Vice Dean for Diversity and Strategic Initiatives for the College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences. To my far left, your far right, my colleague, William Deverell, who's also in the Department of History at the University of Southern California. He's also the director of the Huntington USC Institute on California and the West. He is the author of a number of studies on the American West, including Whitewashed Adobe, The Rise of Los Angeles and the Remaking of its Mexican Past, California Progressivism Revisited, and an 8th grade U.S. history text. And actually, we're very happy to see a number of students in our audience. I know you're probably high school students, so it's wonderful. Next to him is Stan Yogi, who is a co-author of the award-winning book, Whenever There's a Fight, How Runaway Slaves, Suffragettes, Immigrants, Strikers, and Poets Shaped Civil Liberties in California. For 14 years, he managed development programs for the ACLU of Northern California, and he also co-edited Highway 99, a literary journal through California's great Central Valley and Asian American literature, an annotated bibliography. Then next, coming towards me, is Elaine Elinson. She is the co-author with Stan of Wherever There's a Fight, which won a gold medal in the 2010 California Book Awards. Elaine Elinson served for 2 decades as the editor of the ACLU News and the communications director of the ACLU of Northern California, where she organized media campaigns on a wide range of issues, including racial profiling, the death penalty, juvenile justice, immigration, and the right to dissent. What I want to sort of do for us today is to have us launch into this discussion, which again, we hope is going to end up being a dialogue between the audience and us. We're going to try to leave as much time for questions towards the end as possible. And, but to kind of launch us into the subject, I've asked each person, we're going to talk about 3 different questions in kind of framing U.S. history. The first is to really think about in this question of the learning curve on pluralism and the struggle to defend it in the United States, to talk about periods in which that distinction of pluralism in the United States has been challenged, difficult periods in U.S. history in dealing with pluralism in the United States, and how we might want to think about them. That'd be the first kind of area. The second area we're going to talk about is really periods of hope. Times in the past that we can draw from in which we think there's been advancement on questions of pluralism. And then finally, we're going to try to get at that very difficult question for historians to get at, which is, does it make a difference for us to know these histories of the past, and when we think about the present and the future of our society? So let me start with that first question. I'll start with Bill at that end. Major periods or incidents in U.S. history that really are challenges to pluralism in the United States. Where would you go with that question, Bill?
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with my colleagues. Well, let me preface this by saying that historians, whenever they get up in front of crowds, and particularly their classes, they're fond of noting particular moments in the American historical past and saying, this was a period of crisis in American history. This was a period of crisis in American history. We talk a lot about things like the crisis of masculinity in America, and we pick the 1890s or the 1910s or the 1920s. Well, the truth is every moment's a period of crisis in American history. It's just greater and lesser crises. Everything's always up for grabs in American history. And punctuating that by particular exclamation points by decade, et cetera, obscures the commonality of, for instance, crises in pluralism. So I'd open it that way and say pluralism is a contested phenomenon in American political culture, social culture, et cetera. I'm teaching a course right now to my undergraduates, freshmen mostly, a course we fondly call Jamestown to Jonestown, which is all of America, we don't literally call it that, but all of American history in a single semester. And one of the moments when George prompted us with this question, one of the moments I thought about is the early 19th century, which is where we are right now in the course. The early 19th century, coming out of the Revolution, Americans are so remarkably proud of what they'd just done, which was to knock off the greatest military power in the world, and to inaugurate a nation that, at least in its rhetorical ideals, ascribed to notions of liberty and freedom never before seen on the planet, at least rhetorically. And in the early 19th century, we see through the early 18 teens and 1820s and 1830s, this remarkable opening of American political participation based on ideals of liberty, freedom, etc. So, for instance, the white male voting public of the early 19th century expands hugely out of former containers of property and status. That's a remarkable thing, but it's so circumscribed by our hindsight vision, by particularly race and gender. And so in the moment of crisis of this kind of opening, and not opening enough for many individuals or groups who look at this and look at the rhetorical ideals of America and say, come on, live up to those, we see a period that I'm very interested in, the 1820s and 1830s, when, for instance, a remarkably charismatic and intellectually gifted man named David Walker, free African-American man, writes a pamphlet, writes actually a series of things, where he says to America, this new infant fragile nation, come on, are you going to live up to the ideals of freedom or not? Are you going to do something about slavery or not? Are you going to do something about greater political participation for those of us who are not free white men or not? And in a confluence of timing, which is not exactly coincidental, I think, at all, and gets to the crisis of pluralism, this is exactly at the moment where many individuals concerned about the plight of, let's say, free African-American people in America inaugurate the American Colonization Society, which is, you high school kids probably know this, the American Colonization Society is a group founded on presumably humanitarian principles, but the whole notion of that is if free African-Americans in America want to be free, then America's not the place for you. You go back to Africa. You go to Liberia. You go to the capital of Liberia, which is Monrovia in this period, named after President Monroe. And so just as we get this claim about let's live up to this promise and all the rhetorical power of that, about liberty and freedom, we get a countervailing movement that says, okay, I guess there's freedom for you, but not here. And that's a real crisis point in pluralism, obviously. And it takes until either the activities of slaves themselves to free themselves through the course of the coming of the Civil War, or it takes the next generation of David Walkers like Frederick Douglass to essentially pound on the desk of Abraham Lincoln and say, let's live up to it. So it's a real powerful moment in the early 19th century. Stan?
I'd like to begin by sharing something that a friend of mine told me yesterday. He has been watching a documentary on the brain, and one of the things he learned from that documentary, or one of the speakers on this documentary said that we are feeling beings that can think rather than thinking beings that can feel. So I'm going to use that as the lens for answering both this question and the subsequent questions. And I want to focus in a moment in history that intersects with pluralism, the intersection of pluralism and fear. And in part because we're here at the Japanese American National Museum, but also in part because just 2 weeks ago, Elaine and I spoke at the Manzanar Historical Site, which is the former site of one of the camps for Japanese Americans during World War II. I'd like to focus on that particular moment in history. So most of you know that after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 1941, there was set into motion a government program to incarcerate 120,000 Japanese Americans. And that didn't happen in a vacuum. It wasn't just the bombing of Pearl Harbor that instigated that government program. There had been decades of anti-Japanese and anti-Asian namely anti-Chinese sentiment that preceded the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. So Chinese immigrants were the first Asian immigrants to face blatant discrimination in the United States. And one of the things we learned in our research is that Chinese immigrants were very well organized in the face of this discrimination. They brought lawsuits that reached the United States Supreme Court, including significant ones that are being contested today. For example, one lawsuit that Chinese immigrants brought, or the child of a Chinese immigrant brought, dealt with the citizenship rights of children who were born in the United States to immigrant parents. And as you know, that's a debate that's still going on in our country today. And the U.S. Supreme Court case dealing with that incident was brought by the Chinese immigrant community. So Japanese Americans inherited this history, this decades-long history of anti-Chinese sentiment. And in 1920, for example, since we're talking about democracy, Japanese Americans were the target of direct democracy here in California. We were talking about the initiative system in the plenary panel this morning. And Japanese Americans were the focus of a 1920 initiative that would expand an existing law that denied Japanese immigrants the right to own and lease land. And that initiative passed. And one of the things we learned in our research is that when you put people's civil rights up for vote, more often than not, they're denied. So when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, of course, there was existing anti-Japanese sentiment, but the entrance of the United States into the war whipped up even more anti-Japanese hatred. So 2 months after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which authorized the military to designate areas of the country from which anybody could be excluded. And soon thereafter, the military commander of the West Coast designated the western parts of Washington, Oregon, and California, and the southern part of Arizona totally off limits to all Japanese Americans, regardless of whether they're American citizens or immigrants. And Japanese immigrants, by the way, were not allowed to become American citizens until 1952, well after World War II ended. So there was a brief period of time when the Japanese population was allowed to, quote unquote, voluntarily move from the exclusion area, namely to the East Coast or to interior states like Idaho and Wyoming. But governors of those interior states complained that they didn't want the Japanese to be moving into their region. And so the government stopped allowing Japanese Americans to, quote unquote, voluntarily leave and took on the program of forcibly removing the entire Japanese American population from the West Coast. Very few Japanese Americans challenged this during World War II, but there were a handful of very brave individuals who did. One of them was a man named Fred Korematsu. Fred Korematsu was born in Oakland. He was raised in San Leandro, which is right near Oakland. When World War II broke out, he was engaged to an Italian-American woman named Ida Boitano, and they intended to move from California during that brief period when Japanese Americans were allowed to leave voluntarily. They intended to get married and to move somewhere in the Midwest, whereas Fred Korematsu said they hoped to live as quote-unquote normal people. He even underwent plastic surgery to alter his appearance so he wouldn't be as detectable as a Japanese American. And he assumed a false identity and the name Clyde Serra and claimed to be a Spanish Hawaiian orphan. But the plastic surgery wasn't very successful, and he was arrested on a San Leandro street corner soon after the Japanese American community from that town was taken away. So a man named Ernest Bessig, who was the executive director of the ACLU of Northern California, read about Fred Korematsu's arrest in the paper and visited him in jail and asked whether Fred Korematsu would be willing to bring a test case challenging the constitutionality of the government's targeting of Japanese Americans. And even though the prospects were very grim, because remember the climate was very anti-Japanese at this time, Fred Korematsu agreed. And his case went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, which unfortunately ruled against him 6-3. Accepting the government's argument that there was a military necessity, quote unquote, to remove the entire Japanese population from the West Coast. And Fred Korematsu lived with that decision for nearly 40 years until researchers who were looking at documents in the National Archives about the World War II incarceration and Fred Korematsu's case specifically discovered evidence that during the war, government attorneys had intentionally suppressed evidence that showed that there was no documentation of Japanese American disloyalty. And to add insult to injury, these same government lawyers introduced evidence to the court that argued the opposite, that there was reason to suspect Japanese American loyalty. So once Fred Korematsu was presented with this documentation, he was asked whether he would reopen 40 years later his criminal conviction, and he agreed. And in 1983, a federal judge in San Francisco overturned Fred Korematsu's 40-year-old criminal conviction. And he went on to become a real champion for civil liberties and civil rights, speaking around the country about his case to explain to people the fragility of our civil rights and our civil liberties, especially during times of war and crisis.
Thank you. Elaine.
Yes, I'd also, like to join my colleagues in thanking the California Council for the Humanities for inviting us here. This has just been such an exciting day already. And actually, we're celebrating something this year, a centennial, that actually I think speaks directly to this question of pluralism and challenge. We're celebrating the centennial of women's suffrage here in California. Women's suffrage was actually won in California in 1911, almost a decade before the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920. So I want to focus my introductory remarks on what it took for that to happen and the climate that existed at that time. So the California Constitution, the first Constitution actually of 1849, actually granted many rights to women that were not generally granted in the rest of the United States. They included the right for women to own their own property. They included the right for women to continue holding that property during marriage, and also to seek divorce and to have their own property after divorce. So this was very unusual at that time. It wasn't necessarily out of the best motives or sort of feminist view of the founders of the California Constitution, but really they were trying to attract women to come to California because so many men disproportionately had come during the gold rush. And not just women, but women of property. So they figured that if they could, include those rights in the Constitution, that maybe more women would feel better about coming to the state. But at the same time, women, as well as anyone other than a white male citizen of California, were not granted the right to vote. Okay, so that meant for the whole, latter half of the 19th century, imagine what that was like for women, to really be denied, any voice. So the pluralism of literally half of the population was denied any political voice. Women started agitating for the right to vote, quite soon after that. In fact, there was a first attempt to get the right to vote on a ballot initiative, on a ballot measure in California in 1896, but that failed. And there were many attempts to get the legislature to grant the right to vote to women. And, basically women, despite all kinds of extensive lobbying and organizing, were literally poo-pooed by the legislature and also by most of the press in California. Because our book is actually focused on people's stories to kind of illuminate these periods of history, I want to tell you about one particular woman who I think is very inspiring and, kind of gives us a sense of what it was like. She was a very unusual woman for the suffrage movement. Her name was Selena Solomons, and she was a Jew in San Francisco. And she was actually from a family that was very well educated. In fact, her older brother, Theodore Solomons, became the first cartographer of Yosemite. But her father got addicted to absinthe, and the whole family fell on hard times. So she had to drop out of school, and she never finished high school. And she had to work. She taught piano in order to help educate the family. So she was kind of alienated by the mainstream suffrage movement, which was kind of this upper crust, clubby, women's movement, because A, she was a Jew, and B, her family was poor. So although she was a very, very strong advocate for rights for women and for the vote, she did not feel that welcome in some of the clubs where the movement was being centered at that time. We're talking about just after the earthquake, really, 1907, 1908 in San Francisco. So what Selena did was she founded the Votes for Women Club. And this is, for those of you who go shopping in San Francisco, this is right near Union Square. It's at 315 Sutter Street. And she cooked and fed lunch to shop girls and working women in downtown San Francisco and made alliances with the Waitresses Union and the Laundresses Union. And she would cook these amazing lunches, 5 kinds of soups, salads with French olive oil. We actually found a menu for the Votes for Women Club in the Bancroft Library, and I was jumping up and down because it was so exciting to see this. And basically, she wrote on the menu, "We hope that the girl who comes to eat stays to organize for the vote." And she kept a library stocked with suffrage literature, and she invited speakers in, and she did cultural performances, and then she would organize young women to go walk precincts, raise money, write letters to the editor, do all it took to build a political movement to win the right to vote. And, you know, it's hard to imagine, I think, for us now, trying to convince those who have the vote to vote for you, to give you the right to vote. I mean, that's what they faced every time they knocked on doors. And eventually, the vote came in 1911, and it was so close in San Francisco and Alameda that even the Chronicle and the Examiner said that suffrage had lost. But they hadn't completed the vote count throughout California, including Los Angeles, which was a much smaller population, obviously, at the time, and the rural areas. And in fact, you know, in those areas, suffrage won. And so, although it won by a mere 2%, it really changed history.
Thank you.
And we're celebrating that today.
I want to talk a little bit about a group of people that are very large among us, but whose history we often don't think about in terms of this question of civic engagement and bringing them in, and that's the non-citizen. A huge population in Los Angeles, a huge population in California, and you go back in time and you realize that the non-citizen has often served as a very particular scapegoat for other Americans at particularly rough economic times like the times we are in now. And it's a very interesting, for me, issue. One of the periods I study is the period of Mexican repatriation. In the early 1930s, in the middle of the Great Depression, in Los Angeles, it's estimated there's between 100 and 150,000 Mexican origin people in Los Angeles. And the estimates are that as many as a third of them will end up being repatriated in the first decades of the 1930s. A huge and brutal thing, because if you then, like as now, when we talk about non-citizens, we're usually talking about families that are combinations of people who are not citizens, folks who may have naturalized, although that was very low, and folks born in the United States that are supposed to have the rights of citizens. It didn't really matter, because in repatriation, they all got sent back. At least a third of the people, it's estimated, that were sent back, we're talking about at least 40,000 people, were actually citizens born in the United States, born in Los Angeles. What most interests me about this in the conversations that we're having today is that one of the principal people that sort of led these efforts locally was a man by the name of Frank Shaw, who at the time was a LA County Board of Supervisor. He would eventually be famous as the first city mayor to be recalled in Los Angeles later in the 30s. But at this time, he was asking very basic questions about how do we sustain social services in the Great Depression. And eventually, he would run as a moderate Republican. And his whole message was, I wanted to bring the New Deal to Los Angeles, the New Deal for Los Angeles. So he was trying to go off of Franklin Roosevelt's national as a Republican, but part of bringing that to Los Angeles, serving the citizens well of Los Angeles, was specifically to repatriate these Mexicans. Not seen as part of Los Angeles, not seen as part of the citizenry, not seen. In fact, in many ways, one could say that Frank Shaw was trying to create fear in order to rally troops, rally the voters, rally people to understand that the Great Depression wasn't caused by the Republican Party in office and Herbert Hoover, but was in fact caused by these Mexicans. And if we simply repatriated them, got rid of them, we would be stronger as a union. We would be we the people, right? And I think we have to look carefully at the questions of pluralism when pluralism is based on top of a population that is seen as the enemy. It's specifically the enemy among us, right? Now, of course, I don't think that this is uncommon in U.S. history. I think we still have politicians at work doing that today. But I think it's very important to think about the times in U.S. history in which another population has served as the whipping post for someone else's citizenship, for someone else's sense of rights, obligations, and the power of U.S. citizenry. And I think often by looking at the history of non-citizens or families that are mixed, you get at some of these very difficult periods in which there's a real challenge of what do you do when someone who can't vote, not allowed to vote, not participate, is used in the political spectrum as the way in which you rally others to vote, to participate, to be active. Okay, so let's go for hope. That's our side. I think some of the comments have already been quite hopeful. When you think back on all the history that we know, where do you go for hopeful periods? Where do you go for symbols of people or places or organizations that have moved us forward in terms of a more pluralistic society? Who would like to start? Anybody can go.
Should we go the other way?
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, this isn't even what I was planning to talk about, but when you just asked that question, I realized that I would go to the United Farm Workers Union. Okay, and I did work with the United Farm Workers Union, full disclosure, but I also want to say that just last weekend after we came from Manzanar, we passed through 40 acres, which is Delano, which is the headquarters of the United Farm Workers Union, which is now made a National Historic Site, which is really quite amazing. And it was amazing for us to see, you know, Vice President of the United Farm Workers Union, Dolores Huerta, up there with the Secretary of the Interior, Ken Salazar, actually saying this is real American history. This is our history. This is not, you know, we're not going to be on the outside anymore. And I would like to just talk about, again, one person to talk about that period, because I think it really shows how, you know, that when we step forward and take a stand to try to change something, we can really create change, not just for ourselves or who we're fighting for, but much broader. That person is a man named Lupe Murguia. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of him, but he was one of the original grape strikers in 1965. He was a family of migrant workers. He was immediately out on strike when the two unions came together and called the grape strike in 1965 in the fields of Delano to challenge really egregious working conditions of you know, child labor, pesticides overhead always, no toilets or drinking water in the fields, no minimum wage, being recruited by labor contractors who had complete control over your living conditions as well as your working conditions. And the union challenged those conditions by going out on strike. And, you know, there was such enthusiasm and such support because the conditions had been so bad. And the organizing had been so deep in terms of both the Filipino-American and the Mexican-American communities, you know, really gathering around all those who went on strike and supporting them, that there was this just feeling of, we're going to win. That's where the phrase, by the way, for the young people, si se puede, yes we can, that's where that comes from the United Farm Workers Union strike. Well, during the course of the strike, Lupe Murguia was a picket captain, and he and other picket captains consistently were being arrested for breaking injunctions that had been set forward between the Kern County and the Tulare police departments and sheriff's departments and the growers, which basically said you had to be so many feet away from the strikebreakers in the field that they couldn't even hear you, or you had to be literally separated by 100 yards, which means you were standing there isolated and subject to whatever violence may come to you by thugs that the growers had hired. So Lupe refused to abide by those conditions, and he and other picket captains were arrested. They were arrested so many times, maybe a dozen times, that the United Farm Workers lawyers started looking at this and saying, you know, they're only picking out these key leaders to be arrested, and that is not fair. So they actually challenged the arrest, not on the grounds that he hadn't stepped one line over the field or that they were too close together, but that in fact they were targeted for arrest because of who they were, because they were leaders of the grassroots movement of the United Farm Workers. And this case went all the way up to the California Supreme Court. And the California Supreme Court said, in a wonderful decision by Justice Matthew Tabriner, said, you know, this is right. This person, these people, Lupe Murguia and the others, are being arrested because they're known, identified leaders of a movement, and that cannot be. Everyone has to be treated equally under our criminal law, whether you are a teamster or a farm worker, whether you're black or brown, whether you're a grower or a farm worker, you need to be treated equally. And so not only were they acquitted, but there's a new procedure in California law because of it. And if anybody here is a criminal defense attorney, you'll know. It's called the Murguia motion, literally called the Murguia motion, and it means you cannot be singled out because of who you are. It has to be because of, you know, the crime or what you've done to be prosecuted. This has been used to help gay men who were prosecuted because they were involved in the, you know, intimate scene in a park when heterosexual couples doing the same things were not. It's been used to help political protesters who were arrested for trespassing or crossing, you know, what is it called when you cross the street against the, jaywalking, you know, when other people were jaywalking. You know, so it's been used to defend the rights of so many people, and it grew out of this movement for the farm workers, which and many people don't recognize.
Thank you.
So I want to answer the question by returning to Fred Korematsu, but before doing that, I want to return us to September 11th, 2001, nearly 10 years ago. And on September 11th, after I heard about the terrorist bombings and attacks, I had this visceral sense of fear and paranoia and foreboding. And I thought back to history, and I thought, wow, this must have been what it was like on December 7th, 1941, after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, the sense of fear, paranoia, what's going to happen next. And I was also dismayed in the days and weeks after September 11th to see that the United States government was following a lot of the same actions that the United States government employed 70 years earlier during World War II, rounding up people. So during World War II, Japanese American community leaders as well as German and Italian community leaders were rounded up immediately after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Similar things happened after the terrorist attacks on September 11th. Muslim, South Asian, Middle Eastern, Arab American folks were rounded up, oftentimes kept in detention without charges, without access to attorneys. Violations of fundamental civil rights and civil liberties in our country. Fred Korematsu, as I said, spent his life after his vindication, after his criminal conviction was overturned, speaking around the country about his case. He was one of the first people to speak out publicly in support of the rights of Muslim, Arab, South Asian, Middle Eastern immigrants and citizens. He filed a friend of the court brief in a legal challenge to the Bush administration's actions of indefinitely detaining prisoners without charges, without access to attorneys. And he reminded the court, as well as the country, of his experience in how groups of people could be rounded up and their rights violated with impunity. One of the proudest moments of my life was soon after September 11th. I live in the Bay Area. And days after September 11th, there was a rally organized by the Japanese American community in Japantown in San Francisco in support of Arab, South Asian, Muslim, and Middle Eastern immigrants and citizens. And it was so heartening to me to see, even though we were in this climate of fear and paranoia, that Japanese Americans were standing up and were saying, look, we've been through this before. We don't want this to happen to another community. We don't want Arab, Muslim, South Asian, Middle Eastern folks to be targeted unfairly just because of who they are, not because of what they have or have not done. So that was a very hopeful moment for me, even though we're still living in the midst of the aftershock of September 11th. We're still living with the USA Patriot Act, which allows the government to spy on our personal records, financial, library records. Even though Guantanamo Bay is still open, even though people are held without charges, it's hopeful for me that we are learning from the example of history. Japanese Americans and other folks who have historically been targeted are speaking up on behalf of folks who are currently being targeted. So that's very hopeful for me.
I have fairly similar things to say about hopeful actions that are wrapped in anonymity and hopeful actions that are wrapped up into very specific acts by specific people we can call up out of the historical record and do pay honor to. And Elaine mentioned this briefly in her remarks. I think it's very important as we mark the centennial of suffrage in this state for women to remind ourselves that it was men who voted for women to vote. It's an obvious fact, but it's an important fact that the gender that was allowed to vote opened up the polity and opened up the polity to the second half of the human race. And so I think that's an important historical fact, and we have all kinds of cases about plurality and pluralism in American history where you can study those sorts of events where the system does not open up. In fact, it closes and gets tighter. So that's an important thing, and that's the anonymity of hope, with a lot of nameless, faceless men voting to give women the vote. In terms of specificity of hope, it wasn't that long ago, actually, that I was teaching a class at the University of California, and I talked about internment of Japanese and Japanese Americans during the Second World War. And a very bright student who was not from California came up after the lecture and said to me, "You're making that up." And I said, "No, I'm not making that up." She said, that can't be true. That never happened." And the question in her mind was a really interesting one, which was, I've never heard of that, which is fascinating all by itself. But also, that can't happen in America. It's a very poignant, if naive, assumption on her part. And these are really interesting teaching moments, because you can't stand in front of a student and say, "It absolutely did happen. How come you've never heard of it?" So you have to teach to those moments in pretty interesting ways. Now, the hopeful sign of this is that this was more than a decade ago, but not more than 2 decades ago, and it's never happened since. In fact, students now are quite aware of internment, partly because of brilliant institutions like this one. But what we see now in internment studies, which I find extremely fascinating and important, is that we have the 120,000 individuals who are mercilessly picked on in terms of their civil liberties and civil rights, and wholesale violation of those by virtue of ethnicity and national descent. And that's the keystone moment of this event. That's the keystone thing to teach about it. But around that moment of internment and departure from home, etc., are a whole series of both known and unknown non-Japanese individuals who acted with valor and honor and human decency to their friends, neighbors, and kin who were interned. And so watching, for instance, non-Japanese descent school teachers go up to teach at Manzanar or Topaz or elsewhere because of loyalty to those kids and their families, and because of opposition to internment as an act, or watching individuals superintend the property and homes of their neighbors. We have the opposite, of course. We have dark stories, of course. But there are moments of great hope and decency in this that show people's opposition in humane terms, their opposition to what internment was. And those stories are really fascinating as well, because they knit the human community together in a time of great crisis.
I have to tell a story because of those stories. I'm going to talk about two people. One is not known. One should be known much more than, and they both are very local stories. They're about people that grew up in the neighborhoods just around where we currently are. The first is one of these noble people, a woman by the name of Molly Wilson, who has passed, but she grew up in Boyle Heights, just across the river from us here. Molly Wilson is an African American who grew up in Boyle Heights and came up to us when we were working with this museum on a history of Boyle Heights, carrying 2 grocery bags full of letters. And these were letters that she had kept in her closet for 50 years. So we asked her story, and her story was that she had grown up in Boyle Heights and her 4 best friends were all Japanese Americans. And she was a freshman at Roosevelt High School in Boyle Heights when internment happened. Molly was very upset about this. She was upset about this because not only were her best friends being taken away from her, but those best friends had also stood by her when the principal of Hollenbeck Middle School had refused to allow Molly to run for student body president of Hollenbeck because she was African American. So her Japanese American friends had pulled out of their student government elections, said, we're not going to participate in any of this. We're going to pull out of participation because of this discrimination. Just a few years later, there she is, a freshman at Roosevelt, and these close friends are being taken away from the camp. So she said to herself, you know, I'm just a freshman in high school, but I'm going to write every day to one of my friends. That's my act of disobedience. I'm going to keep up with them. Now, as a freshman in high school, she had no idea how long this war was going to be. She didn't know where her friends were going to go. But she decided she was going to do this. And she kept it up all through the war. From 1942, when her friends were taken away, till 1945. Every single day. And what were these letters? These letters were the return letters from her friends that kept coming back to her. First from the Santa Anita racetrack, where the friends had been first taken away. Then from Manzanar. And she was giving now to this museum a set of very personal letters that she had received through this whole process. So when we talk about individuals who made very personal decisions, here's a high school student. Can you imagine doing this throughout high school? Deciding that every day you're going to write to these friends? That's what she did. So that's my unknown person. My known person is the city councilman who represented Little Tokyo. Not a Japanese American. This is from 1949 to 1962. Is Edward Roybal, who's the first Mexican American elected to the city council, but also the first person of color elected to the LA City Council in the 20th century, in 1949. He represented Boyle Heights, he represented Little Tokyo, he represented most of Central Avenue and the African American community through most of this period. I think of him as a very brave person, not only because he was the first, but also because he was bringing together a multiracial coalition to win this seat over and over and over. He came out of a community-based organization, the Community Services Organization, to win election in 1949. But this district, during that entire time, was never majority Mexican, ever. It was always a multiracial group. By the end of his time in 61, 62, it was majority African American. So Edward Roybal, through this whole period of changing time, was able to respond to the needs of a very varied community to represent it well. And of course, he was, for many people, the one liberal voice in the city council for a long time. He became the ACLU's favorite person because when every other city council person was ready to sign a bill saying that every person should that works for the city should sign something saying that they were not communist, Ed Roybal stood up and said, no, that's a bad law. It's a bad law because it strikes at the fundamental civil liberties of everyone who works for the city. And he was the only person willing to do that, to stand up and do that in the city council. In my research on Edward Roybal, I found out that he was also a victim of the very things he was doing. So in the very first, he took office July 1, and that was a Friday. And on the weekend, that weekend was July 4th weekend. And so on that weekend, he decided he had run 2 very difficult campaigns. He had finally been elected. He was going to move up. His young family was going to move into a new home somewhere in his district. He had been renting an apartment. And so he went around to in his own district looking for a home, and there was a new development that was set up for veterans, and he had been a World War II veteran. He said, I'm going to go there. He drove up, he walked out, he said to the realtor, I want to buy here. And the realtor said, sorry, we don't sell to Mexicans here. This is the city councilman, the elected city of this district, being told he can't buy in his own district. And by the way, this is a year after the 1948 case that said that restrictive covenants are no longer legal. He still got this sort of treatment. He was rather upset. So what he did is he had just gotten his new cards. He reached into his pocket. They said, LA City Councilman, this district. He handed it to the realtor. He walked back to his car. The realtor all of a sudden realized, I've made a big mistake here. I just got the city council person for this district upset at me. So he went over and he whispered in his ear. He says, you know, if you say you're Spanish, I can sell to you. He was even more upset. Closed the door, went away, but he went back to the city council, and the next day that they were open for business, he gave a very impassioned defense of the issues of housing discrimination across Los Angeles. And not only he had suffered, but lots of people had suffered. A number of African Americans had suffered in his district, Japanese Americans, a lot of people were suffering from this, and that this should be, and he was the only person willing to take this issue on. Over and over in his whole time, he was kind of the lone person willing to take these sort of issues on. He would fight the freeways being built through Boyle Heights, 3 of them in the span of his time. So for me, when you actually look at his career, it's both his own courage, but also the people that kept electing him. Electing someone who was not necessarily of your own ethnicity, but someone who you felt was representing you well, the interests you had, the community had well. For me, I always take hope in that kind of a politician, that actually there's someone who can represent everyone from his or her district quite well. So anyway, I wondered if we should open it up. Yes, okay, and I'll have to repeat your question just like the thing so it can be taped. Very good question. The question is, are there movements or organizations? We focused on individuals, but are movements or organizations as important, just as important in thinking through these stories?
Okay, I'd like to you know, the 2 examples that I gave, the suffrage movement and the United Farm Workers, those were both amazing movements made up of amazing individuals. And one of the reasons we focused on individuals was because it seems easier for people to kind of get it, what it takes, and it kind of resonates with them. But one of the real foundations of our book, I think, one of the things we were trying to do was to demystify the whole process of what makes social and political change. And it's not just, you know, Cesar Chavez and Selena Solomons and Fred Korematsu, as admirable and courageous as they are, but it's in fact doing that day-to-day work of getting together and figuring out what your goal is and what your strategy is, and, you know, debating with each other and knocking on doors and raising money and writing letters to the editor and doing all the things that an organization and a movement takes. And that's how all of the people that, you know, not all of the people, but some of the examples that we gave today were brought into it. So Lupe Murguia was a striker who then became a farm workers leader, and that changed things. Selena Solomons was a passionate advocate for women's rights, but she was part of a movement. And I think what we were trying to show is that, you know, it's these steps by ordinary people during extraordinary times or ordinary times, but coming together and working together that will really make a change.
The question is, what do we tell our young people who are don't know how to, who can identify battles but don't know how to see battles in the past but not in the present?
Can I take a stab at that? Of course, that is one of the great teaching challenges, because when you teach young people, your first challenge is to get them to realize that the past is just yesterday, not so long ago that it's impenetrable to them. So, you know, I teach my freshmen at USC, they're 18 years old, so they were born in, what is that? What year is that? That's 1993. And so, and think about you, high school kids, when you were born. I mean, for us adults, that was yesterday's breakfast when you were born. But, so you got to transfer that notion to make the past seem both familiar and also understandable in some fashion. And one way to do it with, let's say, collegiate kids is to constantly remind them at certain moments when you're teaching, the actors we're talking about today, the Civil War soldiers, or some of the front ranks of abolition, or some of the front ranks of suffrage activity. These are people your age. These are people who are your age, give or take a few years, who were mobilized either by the vision of individuals or the movement mobilized individuals within it. And they took action because these are things that are very, very important to them. And I know, as well as you know, students, there are things that are very, very important to you. And those things are precious and dear and worth defending or fighting for or preserving. And other people did it, and you should seek inspiration from them. But it's obviously very hard.
One of the most either fortunate or unfortunate things, depending on your perspective, in a lot of the areas I deal with in terms of, if you want to say, the history of non-citizens, is a lot of things have not changed. A lot of times, all I have to do is point to Arizona or to California law and to get at issues that we're seeing the same thing. What does it mean when a local police chief decides to take the people who are arrested for being undocumented and put them out in public pens in the middle of Phoenix, Arizona, in 110-degree heat, right? That's today. What does it mean when the law is actually changed in Arizona in terms of what it means to break the law? We heard earlier about lawbreakers, right? From a misdemeanor in a federal sense to a local felony if you cross the border, right, illegally, so that you become a criminal convicted of a felony in Arizona by virtue of a state legislature or electorate that just changed the law, right? And that leads to a whole bunch of other things, right? All of these are actually present sort of things. And I'm doing the 1930s saying the people in the 30s were a hell of a lot more compassionate. There were actually people that went down to Union Station and sort of worried about these folks that were being taken away that were their neighbors, where people lived together in a place like Boyle Heights and saw this happening. And that these folks can be seen as such non-people, right? So I don't necessarily always see progress. I also like to actually use moments to contextualize history and why it's important. So let me just use something that was said in the plenary this morning. We talked about immigrant parents who came in 1961. And out of having immigrant parents, that should mean a hope. And let me contextualize 1961 immigration law to understand why the context to me is so offensive. What shaped people who could immigrate to the country in 1961 was a racist law of 1924 that set quotas in terms of immigrations based on the 1890 U.S. Census. Imagine that. You're immigrating in 1961, okay, but the law that shapes whether you could come legally or not legally to this country was shaped by a law passed in 1924 based on the 1890 census. Every historian knows that that was a racialized law that said we wanted a population that was more like the 19th century population than the population that was entering between 1890 and 1924. We didn't want Southern and Eastern Europeans. We didn't want Jews. We wanted more of a U.S. population that was white, that was Nordic, that was Northern European. That's what set in motion the 1924 law. By the way, the 1924 law also banned all immigration from Asia, totally. No one can come in from there. We don't want anyone that looks like that, right? Okay, so to say then that I'm a child of immigrants who came in 1961 is to not deal with the history, right? That the law was changed in 65, but the 61 Act was based on a totally racialized U.S. immigration policy that defined certain areas of the world as perfectly okay to legally come into this country, and other areas where you were committing crimes by coming into this country if you came from Asia at all. And you were very unlikely to be able to come in legally if you were coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. In fact, the Jews, the Italians, the people that fought for the overturning of the 1924 Act that was successful in 1965 said that all the time. that was a racist act. And in the middle of the 60s, the United States agreed. So again, when one doesn't know one's history, you can take, my parents were immigrants in 1961, and say a whole bunch of things about it. And I immediately go, I know why those were legal migrations. I know where that person came from. I know where that person didn't come from, right? Based on the basic quota system that governed US immigration law at that time. It's not an equal thing. We've changed the immigration law sometimes to go backwards, to make it more difficult, to make it less possible to go. Who knows, for example, that half of the people that enter this country right now, half the people who are considered undocumented in this country, illegal in this country, enter legally. They overstay student visas, they overstay tourist visas. These are people who cross into the country completely legally, but they are undocumented. They're not the people being targeted, even though they end up having half of the undocumented population in the United States, right? So again, if one doesn't know these things, one can't contextualize those kinds of statements. That's, to me, why it's so important to actually, I mean, unfortunately, I live in an area of research in which I don't necessarily always see progress. And I try to sort of say to my students that you're as easily in an era that's going backwards in terms of progress on pluralism as you are in one that's going forward. And you can never take it for granted how much effort it took to get some of the rights that we sometimes take for granted. Well, it is time to end this panel. Let me first thank all of our speakers and all of the audience for